What if I told you that one phone call could have put a Brazilian song on the best-selling album of all time? That Ivan Lins almost had a track on Michael Jackson's Thriller, but a 10% contract killed the deal that could have changed music history forever. A performer falls in love with a song. He thinks it will fit perfectly in his new project, which will be a huge success. But there are procedures and more procedures. An abusive contract, negotiation delays, deadline pressure from the record label, then the performer loses the song he so wanted to record, and the composer loses the financial opportunity of his lifetime. Who's to blame? This would be the summary of the story that could change the life of one of Brazil's greatest composer, Ivan Lins, and his near partnership with Michael Jackson. But the story goes far beyond this brief summary. I'm Alex, a Brazilian guitarist and composer. Imagine you are an extremely talented and dedicated composer, with countless national hits, multiple Grammy nominations, partnerships with numerous artists, but because you are a Brazilian artist, you don't have the same reach, regardless of talent, as a pop music performer. This is Ivan Lins' case. Throughout his career, he has participated in over 800 songs, released 36 albums, received 11 Grammy nominations. In short, an enviable career. But before we dive into this almost partnership, hit the like button and subscribe if you're ready to discover how close Brazilian music came to dominating the world's biggest album. On the other side of this story, we have the greatest pop music artist of all time, who consolidated his career when music-related products were at their peak. We're talking about Michael Jackson. If today everything ends up on YouTube or streaming platforms, things were very different in the 80s. People to consume an artist's work bought records, cassette tapes, and waited for the release of cinematic music videos. In other words, composing songs, if you could achieve some projection, was a very profitable activity. Just as there were many products associated with music, and sales were significantly higher, the competition was also gigantic. Michael Jackson was the artist who achieved the greatest dominance in this market, so the chance to work with the god of pop seems like something no one would refuse, right? Wrong. Working with an artist as popular as Michael Jackson, for Ivan Lins or any other Brazilian composer, would be equivalent to winning the lottery. At least it seemed like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and this almost happened. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because in the early 80s, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow was about to become very, very real. But in the middle of the path was another character, Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson's producer, and countless other artists at the time. Of course, working with someone like Michael Jackson would be stupendous, but working with Quincy was also something gigantic at the time. Ivan Lins and his composing partner, Vitor Martins, had already signed a contract with Quincy, which, despite having a short duration, yielded good results for the Brazilian composers. They made a contract for about 12 songs, which were recorded by artists like George Benson and Quincy Jones himself. Because of this contract, Ivan Lins had his songs recorded by artists like Fitzgerald, Vaughan, and Barbara Streisand. In other words, only the elite of American music. But the contract's deadline, quite short, was about to expire. And in the early 80s, while Ivan Lins and Vitor Martins were in the United States, the phone rang. It was Quincy. They didn't know what the subject was, but it could have changed their lives forever. Here, I'll relate Ivan Lins' version of the facts, based on the times he told his story to journalists. In the early 80s, Ivan Lins was in the United States and received a call from Quincy Jones, saying he would like to place Ivan Lins' songs with the artist he produced. The contract they had was already ending, and the chance to renew with such a successful producer as Quincy wasn't something to dismiss. So, to close the deal, Ivan and Vitor were invited to a party at Quincy's house. It's important to understand what was going through these Brazilian musicians' minds. Quincy's house is an extension of his success. It wasn't a party in just anyone's backyard, but in a mansion valued at tens of millions of dollars, property of one of the most successful men in the music industry worldwide. Imagine walking into that world, where every conversation could change your career, where the guest list reads like a who's who of the music royalty. When the party ended, Quincy appeared with a huge bag of cassette tapes and told them, Here are all the tapes sent to me to evaluate the songs that entered Michael Jackson's new album. It's all going to the trash. We want you on the album with the song Novo Tempo. There were hundreds of songs from composers like Burt Bacharach. In other words, only the best of the best. You need to understand the impact Quincy wanted to cause. Something like, look at all the offers we received. They don't matter. We want you. The message has two meanings. On one hand, it recognizes that the Brazilian composers are among the best in his eyes. On the other, it also shows the composers that there is no shortage of offers to close the deal. Something like, look, we want you, but if for some reason we don't close the contract, there's no shortage of musicians who wants to be on Michael's next album. Now, here's where this story gets absolutely insane. This album was simply Vaughan and Vitor at the time could only see the positive side and got completely drunk to celebrate. Michael Jackson was at his peak, so having a song on his next album would be like winning the lottery. And for a few days, they really thought they had found their winning ticket. But like every promise of wealth, soon the Brazilian musicians would learn that the deal wouldn't be as advantageous as they imagined. 4 days after the proposal, they received the contract. Vitor read it and told Vaughan, "We're going to have to get drunk again not to sign this." The value division put a tiny portion in the author's hands, about 10%. Picture this, you're holding a contract that could make you millions. Michael Jackson wants your song, but there's a catch, they want to own your creation for scrap. What do? Vaughan and Vitor faced the hardest decision of their lives. It took a lot of courage to say no. No to the contract terms, no to Quincy Jones, the music industry magnate, no to Michael Jackson, the greatest music star of all time. After the drinking session, Vitor was so outraged by the situation that he called Quincy. Both from the alcohol and anger, Vitor mixed Portuguese with English in one of the calls that, to Quincy's ears, must have been one of the most confusing. They didn't sign, but tried to negotiate with Quincy's lawyers. They hired legal counsel, paying out of their own pockets. After all, they didn't want to lose this chance. They just want to be recognized for their part in the deal. But all they managed, after much negotiation, was an increase of another 10%. Something ridiculous if you consider that without a composition, the performer has no material to work with, nor do the producer or record label, however, to get on Michael Jackson's album. Without the extension of this artist's success, many composers would end up accepting unfavorable conditions, if not unfair ones. Perhaps if there hadn't been a deadline for recording the album, the parties would have reached an agreement. The project didn't stop while legal procedures dragged on. Rod Temperton, the lyricist responsible for most of the lyrics on the Thriller album, even made an English version. Vaughan states that if he had access to these lyrics, he could have recorded this version. At least we would have a glimpse of what such a partnership would be like. But while negotiation dragged on, there was a deadline to meet with the record label. And so the song Novo Tempo ended up not being included on the Thriller album. And this album, well, this album would go on to change everything, but they didn't know it yet. Nobody could have predicted what Thriller would become. Of course, none of the composers could know this would be the best-selling album in history, selling over 120 million copies. It was obvious it would be successful, but the proportion wasn't calculable. Anyway, the composers valued themselves by not submitting to such unfavorable conditions. Nowadays, in various interviews where he tells this story, Vaughan Lins openly says he doesn't regret the decision. Of course, if things had been different, today the artist would have another life. Maybe on a paradisal beach in Fiji Islands, as he likes to joke. He states that at the time, he would have had difficulty saying no to Quincy's face, but nowadays he tends to value himself more. To say no, you need to value yourself, especially in a negotiation where they could have closed the deal of their lives. This story isn't about a missed opportunity, it's about something bigger. The courage to value your art, even when the biggest names in the industry are calling. This is a beautiful lesson about valuing yourself, not letting the cultural industry disrespect you out of fear of not being part of this or that project. point, there are no reports from Quincy or Michael about this negotiation. All we have is the Brazilian artist's version. They didn't even have direct contact with Michael Jackson actually, so we can't know how the King of Pop reacted to the contractual difficulties. So, what do you think? Did Ivan and Vitor make the right call? Would you have taken 10% royalties for that song on Thriller, or stood your ground like they did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story blew your mind like it did mine, subscribe for more untold stories, where Brazilian music almost conquered the world.